The audience was buzzing. Laughter rolled through the studio like waves, a typical night on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. Plugged their latest work. That night, the spotlight was on Lee Byung-hun, Hollywood heavyweight, Korean cinema royalty. And now, the masked mastermind behind Squid Game's final chapter. Lee stepped onto the stage to raucous applause, flashing that polite, tight-lipped smile he always wears when he's trying to balance gratitude with anxiety. Dressed sharply, he looked composed, almost regal, as he took his seat beside Jimmy. No one in the audience suspected that what started as a promotional visit would turn into a moment no one would forget. Jimmy started off light, "So, Lee, this is it? Squid Game. Final season. People are already going nuts. How does it feel knowing you're basically the most feared man on Netflix right now?" Lee chuckled softly, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's strange," he said. "You spend months trying to become this person who scares people. And then you go home, and your son..." He trailed off, his smile flickering just a little. Jimmy, sensing something there, leaned in. "What about your son? Did he watch it?" Lee hesitated. The crowd was still smiling, waiting for another charming anecdote. But instead, Lee said quietly, "I didn't want him to." The audience went still. Jimmy blinked. "Really?" Lee nodded. "There was one scene in particular. I don't even want to describe it, but when I shot it, I remember thinking, I hope he never sees me like this." There it was, the moment the air in the room changed. Jimmy sat back slightly, tone softening. "Can you tell us why?" Lee took a breath, eyes darting for a second, as if checking whether he was ready to open that door. Because he's 6, and he doesn't really understand acting. He just sees what's on the screen. So when he watched season 2 clips, without me knowing, by the way, he saw me in the mask, doing those things, ... And he said, "Daddy, why are you hurting people?" He wasn't angry, he wasn't scared, just confused. Like he couldn't match the person who tucks him in at night with the man in the mask. Jimmy nodded slowly. "There was no joke to make here. Did you talk to him about it?" "I tried." "Do you explain to a child that what you do for a living is pretend, when pretending still looks so real?" Lee gave a short, dry laugh. "I think he thinks I'm different now." He looked up, eyes a little shinier than before. "The scene in season 3, you'll know it when you see it. There was blood, screaming. I had to become something truly horrible. It felt like I was tearing apart something I spent years protecting, my image, my dignity, maybe even my soul." Jimmy gently put a hand on Lee's shoulder. "I asked Netflix not to use that scene. In the trailer, not for the fans, for my son." That was when the first tear fell. The audience, still frozen, suddenly understood this was no longer just late-night TV. This was a man wrestling with the cost of the stories we love to binge. Stories that demand a piece of the actors who bring them to life. Lee reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out a tissue, dabbing his eye with a chuckle. "Sorry, I didn't think this would happen tonight." Jimmy smiled gently. "It's okay. This is what people need to hear. There's a line my character says in the final season about how power comes at a cost. I didn't realize until I went home that the cost isn't just in the story, it's real, it's emotional. And sometimes your kids pay it with you." Asterisk, asterisk. The stage lights from Jimmy Fallon's studio might have dimmed. But in homes across the world, the clip of Lee Byung-hun blinking back tears was already making rounds. What many expected to be a light-hearted talk show appearance turned into something far more moving, an unguarded confession. A rare crack in the armor of one of South Korea's most revered actors, and all because of a single question. "Did your son watch Squid Game?" Lee Byung-hun chuckled at first, eyes darting toward the audience. "No," he said, brushing invisible lint from his blazer. Forward, his tone softening. "Which one?" The silence that followed wasn't scripted. Lee's throat tightened. For a man who had delivered countless monologues on stage and screen, this moment required no rehearsed lines. His voice cracked slightly. "The one where I betray someone who trusted me." That look on his face, it reminded me too much of my own son. That scene for those who know Squid Game inside out needs no further explanation. It's seared into pop culture now, the quiet treachery behind a mask. The trust exchanged for survival, and the camera lingering on the face of the betrayed. And yet, Fallon, known for his upbeat tempo, just nodded, allowing the moment to hang. My son, he thinks I'm the villain now, Lee added with a hollow laugh. I came home after filming and he looked at me differently. I said, Appa is just acting. But you know how kids are. They believe what they see. This wasn't just another actor talking about a role. This was a father struggling with something deeper, the blending of fantasy and reality, the consequences of embodying darkness, so convincingly that it haunts your household. As the interview continued, Fallon tried to pivot, but your performance was incredible. One of the best on television. Lee nodded, appreciating the sentiment. Thank you. But awards don't mean anything when your kid won't hug you because he thinks you're a murderer. It was the kind of vulnerability that doesn't trend. For scandal, but for honesty. It wasn't just about Squid Game anymore. It was about what actors carry home with them when the cameras stop rolling off stage. Crew members shared whispers of what they saw that day. One assistant recalled how Lee stayed an extra hour backstage, speaking to his manager in hushed Korean. He kept saying, I didn't want this. Not like this, she remembered. Another source claimed that Lee asked to cut part of the interview before it aired. NBC reportedly declined, citing transparency and journalistic value. Whether that was true or not, fans immediately rallied behind him. One viral comment read, Imagine carrying a character so deeply it begins to fracture. The way your child sees you. That's not acting, that's sacrifice. Lee briefly mentioned season 3 during the interview. Fallon pressed him for spoilers, but he smiled knowingly. Netflix would bury me if I said anything. Expression that hinted he wasn't entirely at ease with what was coming. It goes darker, he said, almost reluctantly. Not just in terms of violence, but in how it tests who you are when no one is watching. My character faces a choice this season that, well, it made me uncomfortable. But Lee didn't laugh. Instead, he added, There's a scene where I looked into the mirror and didn't recognize the man staring back. Later that week, Korean media ran headlines, not about the upcoming season, but about Lee's emotional moment on Fallon's show. Interviews with his wife, fellow actress Lee Byung-hun, soon followed. He's been carrying this weight for months, she revealed in an interview with Dispatch. He watches scenes over and over, wondering if it was too much. He even asked our son for forgiveness. According to Byung-hun, their son, now 7, had indeed watched some of the show secretly on an iPad borrowed from a friend. He said, Appa looks like he wants to hurt people. That crushed Byung-hun. He didn't sleep for 2 days. The confession sent fans spiraling into debate. Should kids ever see their parents in roles like that? It leaves emotional wreckage in the home. Even veteran Korean actors began chiming in. Yoon Ya-young, the Oscar-winning actress, said in an op-ed, acting is not without consequence. It costs us. The question is, do we ever truly know how much? Within days of the interview airing, Netflix issued a brief statement thanking Lee for his raw honesty and praising him as a vital part of Squid Game's emotional complexity. Behind the scenes, insiders claim producers are now reconsidering one particularly controversial scene from season 3 that allegedly depicts the frontman forced to choose between 2 children, one of whom looks eerily like his own son. It felt too personal, one anonymous staffer shared. It was just a coincidence in the script, but after that interview, it doesn't feel like a coincidence anymore. Fans launched a #ProtectFrontman campaign, urging writers not to push Lee's character into darker territory just for shock value. Some even created fan edits imagining a redemption arc for the frontman. Lee himself remained silent, disappearing from social media for several days. When he finally resurfaced, it was with a single post. Thank you for seeing the human behind the mask. Lee took a sip of water, collecting his thoughts, trying to shake off the weight of that last question. What do you say to your son when he asks why people hate you on the internet? That was the part that hit him hardest, not the online noise, not the international press writing wild headlines, not the fans creating conspiracy threads about his character, but the innocence in his son's eyes, the genuine confusion in his voice. He remembered coming home from a long shoot day. His son had stayed up past his bedtime, still in his pajamas. He had asked, Lee froze. He knew exactly what moment his son had seen it wasn't real, but to a child. It was as real as anything. There was no script for this kind of question. There was no director calling. Cuddy bent down and hugged his son. It's just a story, he whispered. His son nodded, but Lee could feel the doubt clinging to him like fog. Kids don't always understand the difference between performance and reality. And sometimes, some praising his role, others vilifying it, the fact that people couldn't separate Lee Byung-hun from the character he played. You know, I thought I was prepared for fame, but I wasn't prepared for the version of myself that my son would see on screen. It changes everything. The frontman wasn't meant to be likable. He was cold, manipulative, a symbol of corrupted power. But no one warned him what it would feel like to be hated by people who loved him only a year earlier. That silent, creeping isolation. There were nights Lee couldn't sleep. He'd scroll through his phone wondering if he had gone too far in the performance. Had he lost part of himself in the process? He remembered one night during filming. They had just wrapped a particularly brutal scene, one where the frontman has to order the death of a key character. He stayed in character between takes. He wore the mask even. When the cameras weren't rolling, it was midnight when he took it off. His assistant handed him a mirror, a routine check, before heading home. He looked into his own eyes and didn't recognize them. There was something hollow there, something cold, that scared him. "I need a break," he told the director. "Just 1 week. I need to remember who I am when I'm not this guy." He flew back home, unplugged his phone, didn't tell the press. For 7 days he became just Appa again. They cooked instant noodles. They played soccer in the park. Just like before, everything changed. His son giggled when Lee slipped and fell in the grass. That laugh, it was the only review that mattered. When he returned to set, he was different, not weaker, clearer. He understood now that storytelling was more than performance. It was responsibility. In an interview, filmed a few days later, Lee said, "When people look at a character like the frontman, they see power, control, mystery. But I see tragedy. I see a man who lost himself completely." That's the warning inside the story, and I think we all need to hear it. As season 3 loomed, the production team kept pushing the stakes higher. The frontman was set to have his biggest arc yet, one filled with flashbacks, emotional depth, and choices that would determine the fate of the entire game. But Lee had one condition. He told the writers, "I want the audience to feel why he became this way. Don't just show him as a villain. Show the human beneath the mask. Show his cost." They listened. They reworked entire plot lines, and in the final episode, there's a moment, quiet, painful, raw, where the frontman takes off his mask, not because he's defeated, but because he chooses to. He breaks the cycle. Lee read that scene in his trailer. By the time he reached the last page, he was crying. It wasn't just the end of a story. It was a kind of redemption. For the character, for himself, and maybe for the people watching who also carry masks. They're too afraid to take off. Asterisk, asterisk, the studio was quieter than usual the day Lee Byung-hun returned to wrap up his final press appearance tied to Squid Game's monumental final season. The energy was different, not nervous or rushed like the early days of press junkets, but reverent, a little heavy. There was a sense among everyone present that this chapter, this era, was truly coming to a close. Lee arrived without a large entourage, just his longtime manager and a stylist who was more friend than employee. Dressed simply in a dark navy suit, he seemed less like the intimidating frontman from the show and more like someone attending a farewell dinner with old friends. Sat down with the ease of a man who had carried the weight of an entire cultural phenomenon and was now ready to set it down. The interviewer, a Korean-American journalist who had been following Lee's career for over a decade, welcomed him warmly. "Let's start from the end," she said with a smile. "How does it feel to say goodbye to this character?" Lee let out a long breath. "Strange," he admitted. "I've played many roles, some for months, some for years, but this stayed with me. It seeped into my life more than I expected. It became part of how people saw me. And even when I went home, even when I was just dad or single quotes Byung-hun single quotes ... that mask ... it lingered." There was a pause before he added quietly, "It still does." That object had become symbolic, not just in the context of the show, but in Lee's personal story. The stark, black mask with sharp angles, now recognized around the world, had shielded his face through some of the show's most gut-wrenching scenes. But it had also come to represent the emotional barrier he had to construct around his own family, especially his young son. You mentioned before that your son thought you were evil after watching a certain episode, the interviewer said. Lee nodded slowly. Yes, I thought he wasn't watching the show. We had agreed he's too young, but of course, curiosity wins. One of his classmates told him about me, and next thing I know, he's asking why I did such a horrible thing to someone in a pink suit. His voice cracked just slightly. It was a strange kind of heartbreak, Lee continued. Because on one hand, I was proud that the role had such impact, but on the other, to see your child look at you like you're not safe, that cuts deep. He looked off camera for a second, collecting himself. That night, I sat him down and showed him some of my older work. Scenes where I was the hero, the good guy. Then I explained how acting works, that it's pretend, that even the people who get hurt on screen go home at the end of the day and have dinner with their families. Did he understand? The interviewer asked gently. Lee smiled faintly. He nodded, but he still asked if I could play a nicer person next time. As the interview rolled on, the conversation shifted toward the legacy of Squid Game. Beyond its status as a global sensation, beyond the record-breaking numbers and critical acclaim, what did the show mean to him? It cracked something open, he said. In the industry, in audiences, in people, it showed that Korean storytelling could stand on the world stage without compromise. We didn't have to dilute our culture or change our pacing or spoon-feed emotions. We just told the truth of our world. Its chaos, its injustice, its strange, beauty, and people connected. There was something deeply satisfying in his tone. He wasn't just proud of the project, he was proud of what it represented. That a Korean language show, led by Korean actors, could resonate across borders and languages. If you had to say goodbye to the frontman one final time, the interviewer said, what would you say to him? Lee leaned back, took a deep breath, and stared at a spot on the wall. It was the kind of silence that made producers nervous. But not today. Today, they let the silence sit. I'd tell him he was a coward, Lee finally said. That just because you were once a victim doesn't mean you get to become the villain. And then, I'd tell him that I understand, because I've been scared too, and maybe that's why I could play him. He exhaled again. It was quiet. And then he smiled, something warm, something full. But I'd also tell him it's over now. Later that night, after the cameras were off and the crew was packing up, Lee stood alone by a window overlooking the Han River. The city lights shimmered, reflecting off the surface like fireflies in motion. His manager waited patiently a few, but his eyes were glassy with reflection. It had been a long journey. He had carried the weight of that role through sleepless nights, harsh headlines, and emotional exhaustion. And yet, through it all, it had given him something priceless. A deeper understanding of himself. He pulled out his phone and opened a text draft he hadn't sent. It was a note to his son. One day, when you're older, I hope you'll understand why I chose this role, why I carried that mask. It wasn't to scare you. It was to show you how people fall, and how sometimes they find a way to rise again. He looked at it, then hit send. The final curtain had fallen, not with applause, but with quiet truth. Lee Byung-hun was ready to take off the mask for good, and behind it, there was no villain, just a man, a father, an artist who dared to show us the darkness so we could find the light.